everybody, and welcome. Just give it 1 or 2 minutes or 1 or 2 seconds here, excuse me, for all the participants to be able to join in. So we thank you guys, everyone, for joining us here on a relatively nice Wednesday afternoon, depending on where you are. But like I said, thank you guys for joining us. Jeff Hanscom with the International Franchise Association. We have a great panel for you guys today, joined by Matt Rodriguez and Michael Saltzman. And hopefully we will have Michaela Mendelson, a California franchisee, joining us here shortly. But like I said, welcome back to our IFA Franchisee Town Hall program. This is offered in partnership with our good friends over at Franchise Update Media. We're continuing this series throughout the summer. This is Town Hall number 3, and having come off a couple successful episodes so far. And this episode, we're going to dive as deeply as we can in the next 45-ish or so minutes. We want to leave time for a Q&A for you guys too, but dive into all things California, FAST Act, now Assembly Bill 1228, and also explore, how does that play into organized labor and SEIU's kind of bigger picture, broader plans for national. So think of this series as being interesting people, hopefully talking about some interesting things that you're facing your businesses every day. And you guys get to hear from us and ask questions. But the whole point is for this to be a little bit interactive, and we want to make sure that you guys can walk away with hopefully more knowledge than you walked in with. You can enter questions at any time in the Q&A box on your screen. We're glad that you're here, and we will do best. I'll do my best to dole out those questions throughout the program to either, to whichever one makes sense to. So you've already, for some of you, maybe, hopefully some of you have been able to join episodes 1 and 2 in this series. We've already been able to hear from former Congressman Romney Davis, who comes from a McDonald's owning family, as well as former NLRB Chairman John Ring. And a couple of weeks ago, Tam Kennedy, who's a multi-unit franchisee, and then IFA's own General Counsel, Sarah Bush, who were all discussing FTC issues a couple of weeks ago. Like I said, today, we're going to dig into all things California, whether that's the FAST Act. This year, it's Assembly Bill 1228, and then kind of where do we go from here, and what does organized labor like to do from here? 3 main buckets that we hope to touch on today. What is the FAST Act, and where is it in the process? What is Assembly Bill 1228, and how did we get here? And then again, what is SEIU and organized labor thinking about more broadly beyond California? Think of it as a little bit of a past, present, and future. And most importantly, what does it all mean for you as a franchise business owner, whether you're in California or beyond? Go ahead, Anna, you can pop it over to the next slide, please. So here, and I should introduce my panel to help dive into all these areas. We're fortunate to be joined by Matt Rodriguez, founder and CEO of Rodriguez Strategies, who we at IFA and some of our partner organizations have been working with Matt and his team for the better part of 2 years now on opposing the FAST Act and now on opposing Assembly Bill 1228. And Matt and his team have been really at the tip of the spear on franchisee engagement in California, and we'll get to Matt's portion in a second because we want to make sure that you guys hear from Matt and what we've been doing with franchisees in California. And then also have Michael Saltzman of Berman & Co., who has been, again, on the tip of the spear, leading the edge of pushing back on a myriad of SEIU's misguided narratives, both in California and nationwide. So, and like I said, hopefully Ms. Mendelson will be able to join us here in a minute. She's a California franchisee who has been very deeply involved with our efforts out there so far. So what is the FAST Act, right? I would imagine a number of you have heard of this. Some of you are probably in California, so are very familiar with it. Some of you may even be quick service restaurant franchisees out there. So, this is something that's touching your business every day. So the FAST Act, which was Assembly Bill 257, this came into being, was introduced back in 2021, which seems like an eon ago nowadays, but it was introduced in 2021. And originally, the FAST Act had 2 primary buckets, right? It was the establishment of the Fast Food Sector Council, and also the statutory implementation of joint liability between franchise brands or franchisors and their franchisees in California. The scope of coverage from the FAST Act moved a little bit over the course of its 2-year cycle, but ultimately ended at if you were a quick or counter service restaurant, part of a brand with 100 or more locations nationwide. So not 100 or more locations in California, just 100 or more locations nationwide. You as a franchisee or as a brand, obviously the FAST Act, the council portion of the FAST Act would have applied whether you were a franchisee or whether you were a Starbucks or a Chipotle. So fast forward through many hearings, many fly-ins, 90 some odd amendments about 2 days before it was ultimately passed by the Senate. What we were left with was the fast food council portion of the FAST Act ultimately was what passed towards the latter part of 2022, and then was ultimately signed by Governor Newsom. And you'll notice that I said the council piece is what passed, because ultimately the joint liability piece came out of the FAST Act as part of a package of amendments at somewhat of the last minute there in the Senate. And again, the council piece is what passed and what Governor Newsom signed. So where are we now with FAST Act and its implementation? All right. As soon as Governor Newsom signed it, which coincidentally, or probably not so coincidentally, was on Labor Day last fall, that began a referendum clock, if you will, or a shot clock for us and some of our partner organizations to pursue a referendum in California. And without going through all the details, ultimately that meant gathering a lot of signatures in a very short amount of time. And what that did was ultimately pause. We gathered the signatures, and here we are ultimately pausing implementation of the FAST Act until it can go onto the ballot in 2024, right? So, that will be put in front of the voters next November, next November. No, November of 24, sorry. 2 Novembers from now, as part of the next general election. And there are obviously various ballot measures and initiatives and things of that nature that will be on the California ballot, not to mention a presidential election. So there are a lot of moving pieces in as a part of that, a broader campaign in terms of pursuing a successful effort in that referendum. You'll see more and more of that as we get closer and closer to the end of 23 and then going into 24, leading up ultimately to the election in November. Go ahead, Anna. So where are we now, right? And I'll mention, like you heard me say that the joint liability piece, ultimately that portion was amended out of the FAST Act, right? And so what happens now? Here we are, fast forward to 2023. Lo and behold, the joint liability piece has come back as a standalone bill. This time it's Assembly Bill 1228. Assembly Bill 1228 in California is basically a cut and paste of language that came out of the FAST Act that would institute statutory joint liability between franchisors and franchisees in California. So basically statutory joint employer. That's what it was. That's what it is. That's what it remains. Now, there are a couple different narratives surrounding why AB 1228 exists in the first place, because one might ask, didn't we already have this conversation and the legislature already decided to pull this out? Yes, we did. And yes, they did. But here we are nonetheless, right? So, depending on who you ask, why is 1228 a thing? There are one of the undercurrents that's going through Sacramento right now as a way that, politicians, and this is not unique to Sacramento, but oftentimes will do some pretty serious mental gymnastics to justify a particular position on a piece of legislation. And one of the undercurrents, narratives, if you will, that's going through, the Sacramento area right now, or the Sacramento legislature right now, California legislature, I should say, is that we being business, we being franchise business, quote unquote, cut a deal last year that, we agreed that you'd remove liability, you'd keep the council, and everyone would walk away. We'll dispel that right here, right now, that there was no deal cut. I shouldn't say that. There was a deal cut. That deal was between Governor Newsom and the California legislature. It had nothing to do with us. Had nothing to do with franchising, nothing to do with restaurants. We opposed it from the start all the way till the end. And obviously that was demonstrated through our pursuit of the referendum. But with all of that said, the notion that we have somehow gone back on our deal is what is helping to drive 1228. So Anna, go ahead to the next slide, please. So what will 1228 do, right? It would obviously lead to, it's essentially a corporate takeover of franchise restaurants, right? Obviously, it'll make it easier for SEIU to organize broadly within the franchise sector, as we, we'll talk about here in a second. But it's statutory joint employer, right? And that has been somewhat of a North Star for organized labor within the franchise model for a long, long time. And but that's one of the primary drivers here. It would obviously invite lawsuits, increase litigation, now that you've got franchisors kind of at the table, if you will. And clearly the most important piece, especially from a franchisee perspective, is that ultimately it will reduce, if not eviscerate, equity in your business, right? Because if you go from a franchisee, independent owner operator, to basically a middle manager, if you decide that you want to sell that business, you want to pass it down to your children, whatever the case may be, what was an individually owned and operated unit is now basically a corporate entity that's being run in California. So, there are some pretty large downstream impacts of statutory joint liability, in 1228. But here, where are we, right? And this is where I'm gonna, start to bring Matt and some folks in. But it's obviously not impossible. We have been pushing on, and I should have paused here for a second. And where is 1228 in the process, right? Given that we're halfway through the month of June, the California legislature convened back in January of this year. So we're about at we're past the halfway point, because they will run through the middle part of September. Assembly Bill 1228 has, despite all of our collective best efforts, recently passed the California Assembly. That was by a mere, one vote. Technically, it was 2 votes, but it really was 1. And so now it's pending in the Senate, right? We expect policy hearings in the Senate, most likely in the Senate Judiciary and Senate Labor Committees, in the next few weeks, ahead of the legislature's summer recess. I'm sorry, July 14 to August 14. Obviously, best case scenario for us is that we stop it in one of its policy hearings in the Judiciary Committee, most likely. But if that is ultimately unsuccessful, we will be teeing up a sprint to the finish from mid-August to mid-September. And that's part of the, that's a good time when we may be coming to talk to a lot of you guys about helping to engage with us if you were not already doing that. So, what is this work included? And Matt will talk about this here in a second. Coalition building, research, which Michael will talk about, framing the issue with voters, field organizing. All of those things are instrumental in our efforts to push back on the FAST Act, or I'm sorry, push back on 1228. Go ahead, Anna, please. Next slide. So, what we're trying to do here is ensure that our message is resonating with voters, right? And if it resonates with voters, it'll ultimately resonate with lawmakers. And so we do a whole lot of research, message testing, polling, but ultimately what this is going to come down to is ensuring that you all as franchisees are plugged in and having the right conversations with the right people. So, with that, Anna, can you skip ahead to the how you can help slide? Or actually, no, I'm sorry, don't do that. Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm losing track of my own thought here. I want to bring Matt Rodriguez, that is, into the conversation. And as I mentioned, Matt we've worked with Matt and his team for, probably going on, it's 2 years now or so. But Matt, give you a second to just introduce yourself to the group and let folks know kind of who you are and what your team does with us.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Rodriguez. We owner of a public affairs firm out here. A core of what we do is really organizing. So we are kind of coalition building and organizing around public policy issues. In this case, against the FAST Act originally, and now against 1228. And what we do is we try to take individuals, organizations, whatever it happens to be, groups of people who are for or against public policy, and organize them to communicate with their elected officials or with the public. So in this case, our main focus is organizing people like yourselves, which is franchisees and folks that are going to be affected by this law. And so we are trying to bring those voices to bear when elected officials are making this decision. And I just want to put a finer point on some of the stuff Jeff has been saying, and Michael may get to this himself, so I don't want to take a lot of his thunder, but the fact is California is, I don't want to say owned, but like that legislative building, it's a super majority for Democrats. Labor, especially SEIU, is the most powerful union in the state, along with the teachers union. They get a lot of these folks elected. And so it is a very difficult field and terrain for a lot of corporations, just the nature of the beast. That's why you'll see a lot of corporations go to the ballot, because it's a little easier when you broaden it out and talk to voters. Whereas in that building, a lot of those members, and the member, this guy Holden, who continues to bring this bill up, they've got a lot going on, right? Both in terms of how he got elected there. He's running for supervisor in LA County. SEIU will bankroll that effort. So there's just a lot of politics among 40 members of the Senate or 80 members of the Assembly that is different than when you get to a broader audience, like you do when you get to the broader public, as Jeff was mentioning, a lot of referendum or any of the other vehicles that we have to talk to the public more broadly, as opposed to just in that building. So that said, that's a little bit about why my team is the direct conduit to you all and to franchisees. We are trying to get compelling stories dotted throughout the state from a diverse set of franchise owners, owner-operators, just to talk about what their experience is, what this would do to the business, why this would be bad for them, how this affects them, and how it affects the communities that they live in. And I think if you look at the messaging here, that is why we are in very shaky ground with the public if we just talk about employees. This cannot be about empowering employees, partly because it's not, number one, frankly. Basically, what this bill is really is that labor is having trouble organizing. You're all corporate overlords, as they would call it. They're having trouble organizing them. So they are trying to get the legislative process to do that for them. And so they're trying to jam these corporate entities in order to do that. So this cannot be about employees. What it is about bringing in national fast food companies to exert more control over your operations. One, that is because that is what it would do. And two is you have a lot of legislators who don't really understand how this business model works. They're just simply going with whatever they're being told by labor. So we have been, it is crucial to get franchisee input, because that's the voice and the kind of frame through which we're shining all of our messaging. These are small business owners. These are people who are in the community. This is how this business model actually works. This is the negative that this would bring to bear on this particular business model in California. So Jeff, that's just the kind of general point. You want me to keep going on this, but I did want to at least start to frame kind of where we are and why we're recruiting, and I can get more into the details on that if you need.
Yeah, I'll just pause you there for 1 second. I appreciate that. So, it sounds as though there are multiple opportunities, multiple avenues for franchisees to engage on this issue. So just kind of, if we take a moment here to just talk through, and you hit on some of them earlier, or hit on some a second ago, some of the opportunities and avenues that you all have worked with franchisees, and how you all have been able to plug them into lawmakers, and just kind of walking through some of the things that we've done and some of the things that we're planning to do, and why franchisee engagement is so important in this effort.
Yes, I'd say a couple of things. Let me give you data, and then let me give you kind of what it feels like in the real world. The first is just looking at the data here. Small business owners and family-owned, you're very popular. I mean, it is kind of the American dream, right? We have a lot of great stories. We have women-owned restaurants. We have immigrant, folks who've come from other countries and started successful businesses. I mean, this is kind of the heart of what small businesses try to do, and trying to talk to the public as well as elected officials, that these are your just basic small business folks who are members of the community, and that their business model is under attack. And if you look at it here, they're very credible voices. You have the most credible voices actually of all. Even unions, which are still fairly popular here, are 20 points lower in terms of their credibility. And so you look at 30% there in terms of very credible, to 47% for family-owned local restaurant owners. That is a big spread. And so we want to take advantage of that credibility as we're talking both to the public and as we're talking to elected officials. So some of this is just to show that we kind of have public opinion on our side. But on a more granular level, a lot of these elected officials need two things. First is education, because and in fairness to some of these elected officials, they've got a lot of issues coming at them. They're not experts. They're not franchisees or franchisors, except for a very small amount of them. Why would they be? So some of this is an education effort. But I think the second one is, if you look at a lot of these elected officials, We need as many voices as possible, partly because you're popular, but for another reason, some of these elected officials are running for other offices. So when they are ensconced in Sacramento, they're very protected by the bubble of labor and the special interests that are there. But I'll give you an example. One of the members we're looking at in the Senate who's very critical is a guy named Dave Min. He's down in Orange County. And in the building, how good will he be for us? I don't know, but he's running for Congress. And so he can get away with a bad vote when he knows he's going to stay in the assembly and labor will kind of help him navigate his world up there. But you start getting more broadly out to voters and you're talking about something that's a job killer, something that's hurting small businesses, something that could raise prices, something that will bring corporations in and help take over small family owned establishments. That is going to be much less popular with the broader public. Now, I can make that case. We can try to make that case publicly, but the people we need to make the case are the franchisees. They're the face of what this bill would do. And as some of these members start getting out from the Sacramento bubble and have to talk to their constituents, things like rising food prices, hurting small businesses, being in the pocket of special interests, that is much less popular as they look at their political futures than it is if they just look at them in the Sacramento bubble. So that is why it is so critical to have franchisees as the face of this. We can make this case, but what will happen is the other side will just say, well, that's just a bunch of corporate, that's a McDonald's or it's Burger King or it's, name any of the franchise corporate entities. They'll just wave that off. And they do that not just for your industry, but for any industry. It's Coca-Cola or it's Uber or they just sort of pass off as sort of big corporations. But if you reverse that and put that in a more localized frame and a small business frame, that's a little bit harder to ignore. And so that is why your faces, your stories, the stories of, again, like I said, a kind of diverse set of franchisees and franchise owners, owner-operators, that is why this is so critical to the organizing effort and the paid media effort that we're trying to put together here.
Yeah. Anna, can you pop to the next slide? Because I think this says a little bit about, yeah, exactly. This is what Matt was just talking about here, is that, it's not about, we're working on making sure that this issue is not, corporate versus worker, because if it becomes corporate versus worker, we ultimately are not successful. But if it's individual owner operator, individual business owner, if it's that story that we're telling and the damage that it will do to that person, that location, that becomes a much different narrative for us. And, in terms of opposing legislation like this. And that's why, as Matt mentioned, that's why it's so important for franchisees to engage with us on this issue. And like I said, there are a myriad of ways that we can work with you all as franchise business owners in California or even beyond, because trust me, if it's not California today, it's going to be Illinois and New Jersey and New York and someplace else tomorrow. So the franchisee voice is always, just so much better to carry our message on this, and your message on this, I should say, not my message, your message on this issue. Here, Sarah, Anna, can you go to the next slide, please, for a second? So I'll let Matt, you want to talk a little bit about kind of these images and kind of how we're working on folks and what we're doing here, just to give them a little bit better of a picture of what it looks like in, as a finished product.
Yeah, just to give to brass tacks. So yeah, so that's the kind of, that's the sort of macro level that we need and why we need you all to kind of fill in the blanks for some of these elected officials and for the public. Now, specifically, what are we doing? What does coalition building mean? And what does somebody like me who's just talking to you over a screen, what do we actually do on a day-to-day basis? Well, some of this is what we do. As we're recruiting you, we're looking for individual franchise owners or individual stories in the legislative districts that we target. Some legislators are going to be a lost cause. We don't waste time. Some of them are already with us. But for the ones who aren't, this is some of, for example, the collateral or mail pieces that we're sending. We're sending some of these in some of these target districts locations. So we'll get people's pictures. We put them up. We get quotes. So we'll be sending maybe mail. There'll be digital, maybe YouTube pre-roll videos or other banner ads that you'll see. We are doing legislative meetings. So if we have, 35 franchises in Senator so-and-so's district, we'll put a packet together. We'll have a list of all the restaurants in that member's district. We'll put pictures. We'll put their quotes in there. We'll get any articles that we get in the paper, an op-ed, a story. We'll send that. We'll post some of these on Twitter or social media. And so we like to go into a member's district and say, Senator so-and-so, here's a packet. Here's the 35 members. Here's 5 articles that have been written. Here's the paid media that's dropping in your district. Here's the economic impact that this would have. And these documents you see right here are some of this collateral. This is kind of how we frame it so that we're kind of on the same message. It's no on AB 1228, stop the attack on local restaurants. Here are some individuals that we have. But to be clear, we can never have enough. We need in-person meetings. We're doing Zoom meetings with elected officials. We have fly-ins that we do in Sacramento that we need people to go to. We need people for more paid media. We need as diverse a set of faces as possible. We don't just want, say, men or just want women. We want everything. We want young and old and immigrant stories and people of color and you name it. We want to show that this is a broad-based industry that really reflects the country and California. But in terms of deploying, that's what we're doing. And we do most of the work, frankly. I mean, obviously you have to help us, but we will point you in the right direction. We will get a lot of these stories placed, but we need your stories and your sign off in order to do that. But we'll do the rest generally.
Yeah, and here just you guys will see on the screen, and we'll make this available. And obviously, like as I mentioned at the beginning, if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box, the Q&A box as we go. But here are some of the simple things that you as a franchisee can do. And I'll talk about FAN more broadly, or the Franchise Action Network more broadly at the end, but obviously encourage you to join that. But specifically on California, which is obviously what we're talking about primarily today, you can head to our website, which is stopab1228.com. There's a place to sign up. That will help. That will let us know that you are interested in engaging with us. There are opportunities for opposition letters, phone calls, emails, meetings, as Matt mentioned, op-eds, letters to editors, coalition advertising, which you just saw, participating in a Sacramento fly-in day. We were out in Sacramento 2 weeks ago at this time. We had over 130 franchisees in town across 20 or 30 different brands. I may be getting those numbers wrong, but it was a big deal, right? That stuff like that gets noticed in the State House. And so there are all sorts of opportunities for engagement. Like I said, everything from being there on the ground, lobbying with us, to signing onto a letter, to clicking send on an email. But most importantly, it's engagement, right? Some sort of engagement helps us move the needle in order to protect your restaurants, your equity, in your franchise business. And ultimately, again, you guys are the best messengers for us in California and beyond. So, it's a pleasure working with Matt and his team. I can tell you from 2+ years of experience, they are the best in the business at what they do, and they will make it as easy as possible, because we know that you all are out there running your businesses every day, and the last thing you need is hours and hours away from your business to, go do a photo shoot or whatever that case may be. We will make it as seamless as possible, so that ultimately you guys can help us ensure that you can keep running your businesses as individual owner operators, and you don't end up as statutory middle managers because of some misguided public policy. So with that, and talking about misguided public policy.
Jeff, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
Very short, I promise,
Yeah.
because I need to move on. I think especially for folks who are not in California, and I know different states have, this is the nature of our politics, which is polarized, and California is very special interest driven, but all states are right and left, especially as they become more polarized. But it's important for some of you non-California folks too. The educational part of this is really crucial. The fact is most elected officials don't know exactly how your business runs. And California is very challenging for the reasons I said. Even when you try to explain to some of the members, they're very beholden to the labor portion of this for all the obvious political reasons here, which we've talked about ad nauseum. But it is really important that we talk about misinformation and disinformation now, which is the obsession of like everybody. But there's just a lot of misinformation here. Most of what the other side is saying is talking about how it's basically, this is about McDonald's, this is about Burger King, like we're holding them accountable. And it's important, especially in some of for those of you who are on this call who are not necessarily in states that are as polarized as California, it's important to really educate elected officials that that's just not true, right? It's an easy hit to say these look at the CEO of X company, it's making so much money, as opposed to sort of explaining how your business works and what this actually means. Because once that kind of gets in a legislator's head that, oh, well, this is just a big corporation, they're just trying to keep us out of there because it will hurt their bottom line. I think it's important for people to understand how your model works and that your local restaurant is very similar to the, Italian restaurant down the street. You run it basically the same way. You have all the same pressures and needs that any small business does. Because if you let this become a kind of giant fight against corporations, that's just much more difficult terrain. And these elected officials don't understand that. They think that, a large corporation just owns all these restaurants. They don't really understand franchising. And there's more nuance to it than these elected officials understand. And I'm not just talking about California. I've worked in a lot of states. So getting in front of elected officials early on these types of things is important, because once they kind of get another propaganda model in their head, as you know, elected officials can be hard to move off of that. And they really don't understand how franchising works. And you don't want the match to get lit and have trouble trying to walk that back. So I did want to add that, especially for folks who are not in California, that they don't understand how franchising works. And there's a big attempt by the other side to make this all about big kind of evil corporations doing all of these things and running like puppet strings what's happening on the ground. And it's just not true. And that's their comfort zone. You got to get them out of their comfort zone. So that's what I wanted to do.
No, perfectly said, Matt, and thank you very much. And I go ahead to the next slide, and I'm going to tee this our guest here, Michael Saltzman, who we're privileged to work with very closely. But as Matt just mentioned, the narrative that the other side spins and portrays is big bad corporate against worker who doesn't have the tools to fight back. And it's not just us saying that they're saying it; they're actually saying it, and saying it as recently as yesterday in the Hill. Mary Kay Henry, who is the president of SEIU National. This is, again, I'm just going to read this. This is a small snippet from an article published by Mary Kay Henry in the Hill yesterday evening. SEIU, the labor organization I am privileged to lead, along with the Labor Federation we're a part of, last week requested the FTC seeking to examine the unequal bargaining relationship between franchisors and franchisees, including, importantly, how that power imbalance affects workers. So just one more thing, our interest in the franchise business model comes out of the now decade-old Fight for 15 and a union. So, and I know Michael has been, next to this kind of stuff for longer than I have, for sure. So I want to pass it to him, but just to give you this, and obviously another quote, this is just give you a sense of what SEIU, Mary Kay Henry are now out there putting in plain sight in terms of kind of what their broader vision is for not just California, but, nationwide as a whole. So Michael, welcome to the conversation.
Jeff, thank you. And always great to be working alongside you and your team. I'm one of the owners of a firm called Berman & Company, and we were founded about 40 years ago. And our firm's reputation over the years has been built on some of the difficult fights that we've sometimes been pulled into and sometimes picked with organized labor. And this fight that you're in right now is probably one of the most difficult and one of the thorniest. And I want to just start by giving you some context on why the union, and when we talk about the union, I'm talking here about the Service Employees International Union, why they're pursuing this sort of broad attack against the franchise industry and doing it in this specific way. The quote up on the screen there is from a quote that Mary Kay Henry, the president of the union, gave a pretty remarkable interview a few months ago, where she talked in pretty candid terms about what her goal is for organizing not just quick service restaurants, but over time more industries. And the reason she has to have this broad goal is because unions are in a pretty difficult situation. I mean, if you read the paper each year and you see the dire headlines about private sector union membership continuing to be at or near historic lows. I mean, when I grew up in Michigan in the early 1980s, all of our neighbors on the street, everyone, their dads all worked for the UAW. There was a time in which union membership, about 1 in 4 workers in the private sector were represented by a labor union. That was sort of the high watermark. Today, it's about 1 in 20. So those numbers have fallen dramatically. And the problem that labor has is they cannot organize fast enough to outpace the growth of the economy. And so even as they organize new workers each year, both through sort of attrition and people retiring, and then some unions losing members, they just can't keep up with the pace of the economy. And so their footprint continues to shrink and it continues to decline. So what Mary Kay Henry and what labor unions more broadly have been trying to think about is, how do we go big? How do we do something at a really big level to sort of change the debate and change the playing field so that we can get a much larger number of people to come into our ranks? The FTC play that Jeff just mentioned is one such approach. Under the leadership of its current chair, Lena Khan, sort of a young 30-something progressive who views capitalism basically as one of the 7 deadly sins, and is basically executing on that mandate and is helping out the SEIU with this current project to try and use the FTC to attack the franchise industry. But that's not the only thing they're doing. I mean, unions are looking at entire industries to organize. They're looking at entire classes of workers, younger workers who are sort of a blank slate, who don't associate unions today with Jimmy Hoffa. They instead associate unions with a cool hashtag on social media, a t-shirt, a slogan, something that is kind of refreshing and hip. This is a very different way to talk about and to frame union issues. What the SEIU is doing is trying to marry that new enthusiasm with strategies like we're seeing in California to organize a much larger number of workers without having to go through the hassle. And as this next slide shows too, they're really doing it with a time horizon that the business community is not always acquainted with. I mean, we sort of specialize in fighting the wolf at the door. Something shows up, we hire the professionals, we organize, we fight it, we defeat it, we go back to running our business. Unions aren't in, and especially the SEIU are not in that perspective. They're in the, we lost the battle, but we're still going to win the war perspective. And they really operate over a much longer time horizon. I mean, this quote from Mary Kay Henry gives you a sense of the multi-decade perspective they are willing to take to win these fights. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important to be so vigilant, and also why you're so fortunate to be represented by folks like the IFA who operate and understand that longer time horizon. If you go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about it. Go ahead and put all those bullets up on the screen. The fight for 15, if you can even wrap your head around these numbers, $100 million, over $100 million spent over a decade on the fight for 15. And it was kind of spun up in a memo in the late 2000s and 2009, where the SEIU, which was looking at the same trends I just talked to you about, right? Declining membership. And they said, well, what are we going to do to solve that? And they said, well, what we should do is we should put all of our money behind a broader minimum wage campaign. And if we do that, people will see the value of the union and they will be drawn to us. And so that was what the fight for 15 was. And the whole idea was fight for 15 and a union. They were pretty successful on the 15 part. I mean, they've, at least in blue locales, and even in a handful of red ones, they've been successful in advancing 15. But what they didn't get is the thing that really would have justified that $100 million. They didn't get the union piece. And so if you go to the next slide, the idea behind sector-wide organizing, I mean, it's really an idea that comes to us from Western Europe, where in countries like Germany, labor relations often happen at the national level, where you have the Association of Employers and the Association of Unions sit down at the table and they hash out wages and working conditions for entire sectors. There are some important key differences. I'm not going to bore you with those here, but that's sort of the inspiration. And so California really becomes the test for whether that model works. Honestly, candidly, it's one of the reasons why the IFA, is so smart and strategic to really draw a line in the sand in California on this fight, because the unions really need to show a test case in one state before it spreads elsewhere. But that's their long-term vision, is that ultimately they want to have not just a statewide bargaining table, but a national bargaining table, because what that ensures is that the special interests are calling the shots. For those of you who are located in New York, you already have a little taste of this with the wage boards in New York, where an appointed panel appointed by the governor basically gets to decide what wage you're going to be paying to your employees, totally bypassing the legislature. So that's the long-term vision with a much broader perspective on how the union might control your business. Go to the next slide, and then Jeff, we can talk a little more. This is the last thing I really wanted to show you on just why the SEIU has this perspective. For those of you who haven't seen these numbers yet, we asked some economists to look at the non-union workers just in 4 industries that the SEIU is focused on organizing: retail, hotels, restaurants, janitorial. If they organize just the non-union workers in those industries, $4.5 billion in new annual dues revenue. To give you a sense right now of how big that number is, the total annual revenue right now, not just for the SEIU, but for the SEIU, UFCW, and Unite Here, sort of the 3 big unions organizing in this space, it's about $800 million a year combined. So going to 4.5 billion annually, 650 million alone in California, gives you a sense of why the SEIU has the incentive and basically the motivation needed to spend the kind of money necessary to get this $1 billion payoff at the pot of gold, essentially at the end of the rainbow.
So, yeah, thank you, Michael. And so it isn't just rainbows and unicorns that SEIU is talking about, and all their righteous might and righteous indignation, I should say. There isn't ultimately dollars and cents at play here in California and beyond.
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, I think what they've been willing to do to in advance of that is throw truth and any commitment to the facts out the window. And if you go to the next slide, I'm prohibited from talking about economic research at the dinner table, so I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about it on this phone call. But I did want to just give you a quick sense of what's being said. We talk to people about these ideas, and you say, well, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and how could somebody get an idea that would be a good thing? And it's probably because they've been fed one of these studies from the SEIU that has claims that are even less believable than the Publishers Clearinghouse telling you that you may already be a winner. We manage a nonprofit called the Employment Policy Institute. It's a think tank in DC that's been around for about 30 years. And EPI has looked at some of these claims, and I won't get into everything on this slide, but the biggest claim was really this idea that the quick service restaurant industry in California should be called out and was worthy of unique scorn because it was such a bad violator of labor laws. This was sort of the core claim of the SEIU. So we had our research team look into it. I mean, they spent weeks basically combing through all of the labor claims from the state and found out that at the end of the day, the limited service restaurant industry in California is responsible for just 1.6% of all wage claims in the state of California. And if you go further and say, well, what about just those locations that are actually franchisee owned? 2/3 of 1%, just 2/3 of 1% come from the franchisee owned quick service restaurant. So it's just flatly inaccurate to suggest that the quick service restaurant industry in California is meriting of some sort of special treatment. And certainly the franchisee-owned industry, especially if you compare it to other industries, in particular heavily unionized industries, have a much higher percentage of wage claims and violations than you see coming out of fast food restaurants.
Yeah, it's somewhat of a stacked deck, as Matt touched on in the beginning, in terms of the hold, if you will, or stranglehold that organized labor has in California and places with similar political makeups to California, New York, Illinois. I was in a separate conversation earlier today talking about the mayor of Chicago and the kind of stranglehold that organized labor has on his administration. And basically, they have positioned themselves. So hat tip where hat tip is due. They have positioned themselves sometimes as gatekeepers to a number of these policymakers, whether it's, like I said, the newly elected mayor in Chicago, former Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, who was the original sponsor of the FAST Act, folks like that. And then those elected officials take this data that is not founded in reality and use it as a way to justify putting legislation forward like the FAST Act or like Assembly Bill 1228. And if it's not for folks like Michael, who are doing the research and kind of the in the weeds work to push back, and then folks like Matt, who are connecting you all as franchisees to tell your story and to help debunk this notion that you all are all out there just wantonly abusing workers for every profit that we can get. Without those pushbacks, this narrative is the only one out there. Anna, go ahead to the next slide. This narrative is the only one out there. And so it's the only one that legislators and policymakers hear. And that's why it is so important. Like I said, whether it's California and it ultimately, Mike mentioned, we are doing our best, obviously, to draw a line in California. We've invested heavily, both financial resources, and just sweat equity from everybody on the team at IFA to a lot of our brands who are members, a lot of franchisees. But, we are very cognizant of the fact that even despite our best efforts and your best efforts collectively in California, the FAST Act's passed. Now we pursued the referendum, and obviously we will continue pursuing that to do everything we can to ensure that it does not become law in 2025. But that 1228 has a viable chance at also passing. And what does that do? That ultimately will embolden the other side to continue and take this. And Mary Kay Henry, who we've read various quotes from, has said as much, that they don't plan to stop in California, right? They want a national bargaining table. And so that's why it is so important from a franchisee perspective to remain engaged with us, whether it's in California or whether, again, it's in New York or New Jersey or Illinois or wherever it's going to be next, because I can guarantee you that it will be someplace next. And, we're going to do our best to obviously fight continually against it. But like I said, it's incumbent upon us to present obviously this issue to you all, but also to help make it as easy as possible for you all to tell your stories at all levels of government. So I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here. So if you do have questions, just drop them in the chat box. And if you're going to make it easy on us, that's okay too. We can give everyone a few minutes back at the end of their day, depending on which coast you're on, the end of the day here on the East Coast, or at least nearing towards that. Anna, go ahead to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the outset, this was episode 3, we still got a minute. So it still is episode 3 in our ongoing town hall series that we will be running throughout the summer. We've got another one coming up a little bit later this month. Obviously an introduction to joint employer. We touched on it here. It is somewhat of a overarching umbrella to everything, not everything, a lot of the things that we do as the IFA to help protect the franchise business model, whether it's in Washington with, the FTC, the NLRB, the Department of Labor. Joint employer has been an issue that has been kind of our guiding star, if you will, since about 2014 or so. But we'll touch on that one. And, going throughout the summer, we've got franchise relationship bills, we've got equity, existing franchise ecosystems, we've got making a good case for franchising, all sorts of opportunities for you guys to plug in. We hope you find it useful. We want to continue doing this. Like I said, we've got a number of them going on throughout the summer. So please continue to join. And I mentioned at the outset, the Franchise Action Network. It's obviously we've tried to, again, one theme of today is trying to make it as easy as possible for you guys to engage. The Franchise Action Network is the IFA's, the name implies, it is the way that we plug you all as franchisees into our various advocacy efforts. Again, whether it's in DC, whether it's at the FTC, whether it's in California, or whether it's in places that, like Arkansas or New Jersey, or we've got issues across the board. That much I can guarantee you. But we do rely on you all to let us know who you are, where you are, and then we can work with you to tell your stories and get you all engaged with the issues that are going to impact you and your businesses, depending on where you're located. So I would encourage you to join the Franchise Action Network. And as a part of that, Anna, go ahead. We have our upcoming IFA Advocacy Summit. That's a little bit of a tongue twister as it is freshly rebranded this year. But our this formerly the Franchise Action Network annual meeting, now the IFA Advocacy Summit here in the second week of September. This will be your opportunity to come to Washington to meet with members of Congress across the aisle, across the Capitol, senators, congressmen and women. It'll be a multi-day event here in Washington. For those of you who have done this before, think of this as a fly-in because that's essentially what it is. But you will be in DC with 400 plus of your closest franchisee friends, meeting with, like I said, elected officials across the board, Republican, Democrat, all over, just to tell the franchise story and just to give you a sense of why this is important. Obviously, if we haven't done that over the last 55 minutes here. Last year, the primary ask of the IFA Advocacy Summit was encouraging members of Congress to sign on to a letter encouraging the FTC to essentially do no harm to the franchise business model. We had a whole host of members, bipartisan list of congressional members sign a letter to the FTC doing just that, ensuring that your voices are heard through your elected officials and over to the agency. So it is important. We'd encourage you to get to Washington and join us later in September. Obviously, if you have questions about that, let any one of us know. And there was a question here that, yes, we are recording this meeting. We will make it available to folks. So if you don't see that here in the coming days, just reach out to me or anyone else on the IFA team. We'll make sure that you can get a copy of it. So with that, I don't see any other questions here in the queue. So I want to just say thank you to Matt and Michael for joining us. More importantly, thank you to all of you guys for taking nearly an hour out of your Wednesday afternoon to join us for this episode 3 in our IFA Franchisee Town Hall, brought to you with our friends over at Franchise Update Media. So thank them for their support. But like I said, if you guys have questions about anything we've talked about today, or really any other advocacy related issues, feel free to reach out to myself at IFA or anybody else on the team. We'd be happy to get you pointed in the right direction. But thank you guys very much and look forward to talking with you soon.